So Sara Roelofse was born in Amsterdam in either 1626 or 1627. And her parents were both born in Norway, in different parts of Norway. And they met in Amsterdam and they married in Amsterdam because there was a large immigrant Scandinavian population in Amsterdam, because people came from all over Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, to the Netherlands at that time, because the Netherlands had opportunities for people, but there weren't enough opportunities for everybody who came. So some of them went to the Dutch colonies, and that's what Sarah's family did. And so the Netherlands, the New Netherlands, was one of the places that the people from the Netherlands came. Another one was Brazil, another one was Indonesia. But the advantage of New Netherland is that the climate was the most like the Netherlands and was also the easiest to get to. So in 1630, the family came to New Netherland, to Rensselaervik, which is up by Albany. It was her parents, her aunt, her younger sister, and her grandmother. So the whole family came together, and they worked up in Rensselaervik for the patroon. Well, her father did, Kilian van Rensselaer. But after 4 years, they came down the river, they moved to New Amsterdam. And while they were up there in Rensselaervik, when Sarah was a small child and her sisters were small children, they picked up Native American languages because the patroon's director wrote back to him, and the letter is still extant, that he's not happy with Rolof Jansen, who was her father, because all the women are traders, not traitors, but traders. So they were taking a share of the Indian trade that he wanted. So in 1634, the family moved to New Amsterdam. Her father died in 1638. And a couple of years later, her mother married Domine Bogardus, and he was the minister, and he was a man of high status within New Amsterdam. And in 1642, Sarah herself married Hans Kersted, and he was 30, she was about 16. He was a surgeon. So he was also a man of fairly high status in the community. And then in 1644, their first child was born. In 1647, they moved to a house on the Strand. And in 1666, her husband died. She married again in 1669. He died in 11 years later. And 1683, she married again for the third time. And she outlived her third husband and died in 1693 herself, sometime between August and October. So this is what New Netherland looked like around that time. And the Netherlands was an extractive colony. It was set up by the Dutch West India Company, and almost everybody who lived in New Amsterdam, and a lot of the people who lived in New Netherland, but especially in New Amsterdam, were employees of the Dutch West India Company. Everything from carpenters to surgeons, which Hans Kersted was, to merchants, to farmers, they all worked for the Dutch West India Company. But then there were the patroon ships that were large tracts of land that were granted to individual men. There were a couple that didn't succeed, one on Staten Island and one in Pavonia, but the one up by Albany, Rensselaervik, that's the only one that did succeed. And if any of you ever taken the PATH train, when you go through the Pavonia station, that's named for the old patroon ship of Pavonia, sorry. Okay. All right, now why is this not advancing? There we go. Now, this was the extent, more or less, of New Netherland. And up here is what's now Albany with Rensselaervik. And of course, down here, New Amsterdam. And this is the heartland of New Netherland. Now, New York and New Jersey, of course, didn't exist as separate entities until after the English took over in 1664. So New Netherland is mostly defined by the Delaware River in the south, which the Dutch call the South River, and the Connecticut River up here. So this is where we have New Netherland. Now, of course, there were people here before the Europeans came, and different groups of the Lenni Lenape. And you can see all of the different languages with the dialects, but they're all, excuse me, they're all part of the Lenni Lenape. Now, we're not sure what languages Sara and her sisters learned when they were little kids, but we know that they learned enough that they could communicate with the Indians who lived down here, with the Americans who lived down here. Oh, and here you see Pavonia. Okay. Now, this is a sketch of New Amsterdam in 1650. So the European settlers who came here, only about 50% could be considered as Dutch, people whose families had lived in the Netherlands for generations. The other 50%, most of them were Northwest European Protestants, but there was also a scattering of people from Southern Europe, a scattering of people who were not of the Dutch, not Protestant, not of the Dutch Reformed Church. The first Jewish families came here in 1654 when they had to leave Brazil after Portugal took Brazil back from the Netherlands. But this is a rough sketch of what the city looked like in 1650. And this is a redrawing of it by a professional in around 1660. So you see here, whoops, wrong one. This is the beach called the Strand of the East River. Okay, so here you see the shoreline has not yet been improved. Big ships couldn't come right up to the East River. They had to offload onto smaller ships that would come up here. And you have the houses that are built along the riverside. And here's the Stadthouse. That was the first city hall. And down here, a little bit off this picture, is where Stuyvesant lived. And here's the fort with the windmill on the fort. And these are for offloading boats. They're often described as the gallows when you see this picture illustrated someplace, but they're for offloading because you had all of these little boats coming in off the big boats. Okay, so in 1642 is when they got married. Now, there's a historical incident attached to this marriage that David de Vries wrote about when he was complaining about the governor at the time, Governor Kieft, back to the officials in Amsterdam. He said that after everybody had had a lot to drink at the wedding, then Governor Kieft said that he was going to subscribe a large amount of money to build a new church in the fort. And everybody feeling very convivial and everybody having a good time and everybody wanting to one up each other, they all pledged money to build the church. And de Vries said that it was a scandal that the first thing the people in New England did was build a church. And here in New Amsterdam, they did not have a church. All they had was a mean barn. And this is a plaque that was put up by the Daughters of the Holland Dames here on Broad Street, talking about the first church. And it doesn't say anything about that the first church was really the loft of what was one of the warehouses of the Dutch West India Company. So here's an example of taking out of history what you want and putting the best possible light on it. Okay. So this is what the city looked like in the 1640s, 1650s. See, here's the old church. Here's the fort. Here's the Stadthouse. And here's the wall. Okay, now this is a contemporary drawing based on this, the Castello plan, which some of you are probably familiar with. map that was drawn by the surveyor Jacques Cortegut for the people who were governing the West India Company, to show them what their colony looked like. This canal has been dug to drain the area that was sort of low-lying and marshy here. And the wall has been built. And they had thought to extend the canal all the way up so it could be used as a line of defense. But once you get here in Manhattan Island, this is where the bedrock starts coming closer to the surface and it's harder to dig through. And if you think about the west side with the Palisades and the east side with just the shore, the sloping beach, that's why the settlement is concentrated on the east side, because it was much easier to get up to it. Okay, now after 1647, this is where Sara Roelofse and Hans Kirstead had their house. And Dutch women kept their own name. They did not take the name of their husbands usually. And here is a redrawing of the Castello plan. And by the way, the Castello plan is not made by somebody named Castello. It's because this copy was found in a small castle in Italy. So that's why it's the Castello plan. The original has been lost, but this is the copy that was found. Okay, so here you can see, once again, the canal, the Herrengracht, and today this is Broad Street. And this is pointing uptown. Here's the wall, the governor's house, and this is the house where Sarah and Hans Kirstead lived. And you can see that this is a planned city. These are not haphazard streets. You'll hear people say that when you go down below Wall Street, the streets are haphazard. They're not. It's laid out on a Baroque city plan with the fort as the center and then these diagonal lines radiating off. So it's not a grid plan, but it is a planned city. Okay. So they had lots of children, starting in 1644, 1647, and you can see all of them down here. And Hans Kirstead died in 1666. Otherwise, there probably would have been more children. And this is the normal birth order for a woman who nurses her own children and doesn't use any sort of birth control, between 2 years and 3 years or so. So this is very typical. What's not typical is how many of the children survived. Only 2 of them died young. The first Anna and the first Jacob. And she had 1 child with her second husband, Cornelius van Borsum. Okay, now these are the people that they chose to have as the sponsors for their first child. The governor, the fiscal, who was like the chief financial officer, her stepfather, the minister, her grandmother, and her aunt. So here they have this precious first child, and they pick all of the powerful men in the city, in the town, to be his sponsors. Because when you're picking godparents for your children, you go up, not down. But they had all of these powerful people that were the sponsors of their first son. After that, it goes to the family. You've got sisters, sisters-in-laws, and so the first one was often the most important. And this is about the same time period, 1664. And of course, you wouldn't have this fancy furniture and this sort of floor in New Amsterdam, but possibly the same sort of celebration. And people took pride in large families. And when your children survived and they grew up, then you could be proud of it. Now, this family, of course, is dressed in their very, 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 very best for the portrait. People wouldn't have worn this normally. And this is a Dutch family, not a North American family. Okay, so what did their house on the Strand look like? This is a redrawing, a modern redrawing of the Castello plan. And the buildings are drawn to look like Dutch houses, which have their narrow side to the street. So it's a narrow side fronting on the street. And the Castello plan did show them like that. And we can look at genre paintings to see what perhaps the interior of the house looked like. And here's a simple house. And the windows were probably like this, small panes with lead to hold them. The fireplace was almost certainly like this. It's called a jambless fireplace. It's right up against the wall. You know how modern fireplaces go into the wall? And English fireplaces also went into the wall. But Dutch fireplaces didn't have any side pieces. They were just right there on the wall. And this is probably iron that's going to protect the wall from the flames. And the mother here is making lace. A lot of women did that, but it's highly skilled. You can see she's got all the bobbins and things here. And I like the little boy who's amusing his younger sibling. And typical meal, bread, cheese, and butter. Okay, so we can look at the pictures, but it's also good to have something you can hold in your hand. And that's where archaeology comes in. So here we've got the original shoreline, the original strand, and their house was right about here. This was taken before there was excavations there. Now, it's not just this one site, though, that we can use to say what New Amsterdam looked like. Because if you look here, here's New Amsterdam, the original shoreline. And then when the shoreline was stabilized in 1650, and then it came out here in the 1690s, and then 1800, 1965, 1980, you can see how much Lower Manhattan has built out into first the East River and laterally into the Hudson River. So what do people use to make this landfill? Well, they leveled the hills because, for instance, there was a hill here that was leveled and dumped into the landfill, and then they used garbage. So landfill is great for archaeologists because it's full of garbage, and especially demolition debris, because what are you going to do with all this garbage? Well, up until Fiorello LaGuardia in the 1940s, what did New Yorkers always do with their garbage? They dumped it in the river. And it started in the 17th century. So if you're making land, and here's the original shoreline, so you want to fill in all of this. Garbage is one of the best things you can fill it in with. And here's where approximately where their house was. So all of this has been built out, and there's a battery wall by the 1760s, but this is all landfill. Now, the South Ferry project that happened, it was part of the funds that New York City got after 9/11 to beef up accessibility and try to make New York more secure. The South Ferry project is in blue here. And what it was designed to do was modernize the subway station here. Because I don't know if you've ever taken the subway down by South Ferry before this project, and you can't get off, you couldn't get off from the first cars or the last cars on the subway. You had to walk to the middle because the train was too long to fit in the station. So what this project did is it extended the station. And because all of this is historic landfill, and because it was the federal government giving the money, there had to be archaeology. And what we found during this project, what we got from the landfill, was lots and lots and lots of demolition debris. And once again, you can see here's where their house was. Here's the original shoreline. And these are slips where it was left space for ships to come in, and the battery, and down here is Battery Park now. Okay, so we found roof tiles, and they were hung on the rafters with these lugs. You can see here, they're all on this house roof. So they hung on the rafters, and then they overlapped on the edges. Some of them were glazed with a clear glaze, and some of them had this black glaze on them. These are still made, still used on some buildings today. My younger sister went to college at Alfred University, which is famous for its ceramics, and some of their 19th century buildings had these roof tiles on. And when my sister was there, you couldn't use those buildings because the roof tiles were so heavy that they were crashing in. So until Alfred could figure out what to do with it, they couldn't have classes in those buildings, which was kind of a shame. So probably what happened is that as these buildings got to be derelict, later on, they were demolished and dumped in as landfill. So we have things that are definitely from the 17th century in the South Ferry landfill. Now, in addition to roof tiles, we have floor tiles. And here you've got marble in the fancy front part of the house, but in the private part of the house, you have earthenware, red-bodied earthenware. Then there's a white or a buff slip, which is a thin layer of clay on it. And then it's covered with either a lead glaze without any coloring in it, which makes it look yellowy brown, or copper, which makes it look green. So we know that people had these in their houses too, like in this Dutch house. And then wall tiles. See along here, the blue and white tin glazed wall tiles. We found lots of them. And you can see them here, back of the fireplace, and here along the wall. And they would help to keep the fireplace clean. They'd help to keep when you wash the floor, all of the water wouldn't get on the wall because the wall would just be plaster. And you can see here too, a jambless fireplace. It's flat against the wall. Okay, now the tiles that you see in paintings are simple because it's easier for a painter just to paint a simple tile. But most of the ones that we excavated were not simple. And a lot of them had Bible stories. Like if you look at this one, this is kind of obvious, isn't it? What Bible story this is? See, it's the 10 Commandments. And as is often found in Northern European Renaissance art, Moses has horns, which are really not horns. They were supposed to be beams of light that Michelangelo showed coming from Moses's forehead, but other artists interpreted it as horns. So there you go. And this, of course, is a scene from the crucifixion when one of the Roman soldiers offered Christ a sponge that was soaked in vinegar, because drinking vinegar is supposed to slake your thirst. So if these are around the fireplace and it's in the evening and there's little kids around, you can tell them stories because the books are on the walls. There's no writing, but you can tell them the stories because somebody says, why does he have horns? Or what's going on here? And people can tell the kids stories like this one. This one took us a while to figure out. This is a lion. Here's a man on a donkey. So what story was going on? Well, it's a variation of Saint Jerome and the donkey and the lion. The lion was injured. Monks in a monastery befriended him and he stayed there and he helped the monks. The donkey would go every day to get wood and the lion would go with the donkey, and then they would come back and the lion would protect him. But one day there were a group of merchants that were coming by, and they kidnapped the donkey. And then when the lion went back to the monastery, of course he couldn't talk. So the monks thought that he had eaten the donkey, and they punished the lion. They made him gather the wood by himself for a year. But then the next year, those same merchants came back, and the lion recognized his donkey. So he attacked the man who had stolen his donkey and made him come back to the monastery. The man confessed his sin and was so remorseful, he donated a lot of money to the monastery. Now you could see how you could make that story last a good half hour, you know. And, it's sort of like sitting around a campfire and telling stories, but you have the pictures in front of you. And this one's my favorite, really, out of all the tiles we found. So what do we know about her life from the documentary record? Well, the first one concerns when Hans Kjærstad and Sarah and several other men and their wives were invited to a local tavern by another couple to have a pleasant evening. And during that pleasant evening, they were interrupted. And I'm going to show you this next slide that has a lot of text on it. And I'm not going to read it, but I'll just summarize it. But it'll be there in the recording if any of you ever want to read it yourselves. So basically, a drunk came in and he was pestering everybody, and he drew his sword. And here you have this very vivid picture. They tried to keep him out of the private room where the party was, long time resisted by the landlady with a leaded bludgeon, and by the landlord by keeping the door shut. But finally, the drunks burst into the room. They were very insolent. They drew their swords. The shout and the fiscal were sent for, and they were routed. But that broke up the party. We broke up our pleasant party before we had intended. So you get the picture of people just out for a night spending with friends. And this was in 1644. So Sarah was most probably pregnant. And you can imagine being in, because probably a lot of us have been in this position, you're someplace where people are drinking and somebody drinks too much and they get really out of hand. So now, on the other hand, she is listed as one of the good women, a goede vrouw. And in 1662, there was a case that came before the magistrates that they didn't want to rule on. It was a case between two women, one woman saying that she wasn't paid for her work, the other woman saying, well, you did a terrible job, so I'm not paying you. So it was supposed to be decided by the good women to look at the caps to see if they really were poorly made or if the lady should be paid. But Sara Roelofse, appointed by the court, will not have anything to do with the matter, as she will not be opposed to either one party or the other. And this also says something about her position in the community and her personality, I think. Now, caps were very important. Women wore them almost all the time, you see in the paintings. Sometimes they will have something over it, like a scarf or another kind of headdress, but there's always a cap underneath. And this, I think, would have been stiffened with metal and a little bit of embroidery here, or crochet and linen. But you see the caps all the time. So it was a very important thing that this woman had been given linen to make caps and either did a bad job or not. Now, probably what most people know about Sara Roelofse is the fact that she acted as a translator between the Dutch and the Americans. Now, she also was what we call a cultural broker. She was somebody who understood, I think, both cultures. And this is a mural that was painted as part of a WPA project that's in Leonia. And here's Sara, and here's Oratom, who was one of the sachems of the Americans. And then here are the Dutch. She served as an interpreter many times, but the most important one, I think, was in 1664. Now, the English got there in September of 1664, so this is before that. And she was one of the interpreters. She might have been Oratom's personal interpreter, we don't know. And her name is on the peace treaty. So this is some place where she is in the documents, where she's in the documents as herself, not as just a woman in New Amsterdam or as the wife of Hans Kierstead. It's who she is because of her talents, because of what she can do, because she understands how to be an intermediary between the Americans and the Dutch. And she was given a piece of land, a neck of land given to her by Oratom, the sachem of the Hackensack, lying between the Hackensack River and Overpex Creek. And he says he's giving it to her in consideration of the friendship he had received from her. So she wasn't buying it from him. He was giving it to her because of the friendship that existed between the two of them. Now, she died in 1693, sometime between August, when she put a codicil in her will, and October, when her will was sent for probate. So she had land in New York City, in New Jersey, and she left some properties to different of her children. Her oldest son, Hans, predeceased her, but she divides his portion between his children. And then there's her daughter, Anna van Borsum. On account of her simplicity, she leaves my small house and kitchen between the land of Jacob Maritz and my bakehouse. And this is where I first got interested in Sara Roelofse, because I was interested in foodways in 17th century New Amsterdam. So somebody having their own bakehouse is a pretty significant thing. The kitchen that she talks about was probably an out kitchen like this, because all the cooking is done over a hearth, and you don't want to cook over a hearth in the summertime. And if you're not going to cook outside for one reason or another, and in the city, in the town, you probably couldn't cook outside, you would have a kitchen, an out kitchen. This is a late 18th century one that still exists in Montville. The house is long gone, but the out kitchen is still there. And the people who owned the house deeded this to the town. Now, within a kitchen, you would have a hearth and you might have a bake oven. And here's the interior of the bake oven. And the way these ovens worked is you built a fire inside it. You let the bricks get really, really hot. You let the fire burn down. You raked out the ashes, usually using a turkey's wing. Then you put the bread in and you closed up the door. So the bread baked by the radiant heat coming off the bricks, not from direct flame. It gives a very good crust and a very soft interior. That's why all the brick oven bread that's advertised, that's what they're referring to. Now, a bakehouse is something different, because it would be centered around an oven, and the oven would be a bake oven. The oven would be bigger than you would get here, which would take maybe 6 or 7 loaves. But in a bakehouse, you would bake a lot of bread. Now, we know that Sara was not a licensed baker in New Amsterdam, because to be a baker, because bread was the most important food for people. So to be a baker, you had to be licensed by the town. And we have lists of the bakers and their names, and she was not a licensed baker. So what was she doing? She was probably baking bread for her family. She had 8 kids. They had kids. There was a lot of people that were eating bread. So I think that Sarah was baking bread for her whole extended family, which is why she had a bakehouse. Now, we don't know exactly where that bakehouse was, and we didn't find any trace of it when we did the archaeology there at the Broad Street site. But this is an example of a 19th century bakehouse in France where the community would bring their bread. You'd make your own bread, and then you would bring it, and everybody would bake it in the oven, and you would have to mark your loaf so you knew which was which. Okay, so bread was the most important food, and most people would eat a loaf of bread like this a day. This is a 4-pound loaf. This is a 2-pound loaf. So you might eat a 2-pound loaf. Bread was the most important and the basis of the diet. And then you've got pretzels, see here, and salt that you could dip the pretzels in, this basin of salt, and all sorts of rolls. Now, these are rye bread, and with wheat, of course, because rye bread is both rye and wheat. And these would be white rolls made out of wheat. And here, some fancy rolls. Don't they look like hot dog rolls lined up there? So, and the baker would blow the horn to let everybody in the neighborhood know that the bread was done. This is a commercial baker. And you can't always judge exactly when the bread is going to be done because a bake oven is not precise. So the baker would blow this horn to let everybody know the bread was out of the oven, come and get it, kind of thing. And more and different kinds of breads. This is Vermeer's The Milkmaid. And if you ever go to Amsterdam and see it, it's small, but these are little points of light coming off the bread, and it's really, really fantastic. And again, bread, cheese, and this is how butter was usually shaped, in this sort of rounded rectangle. The top would be rounded off, and you just take the butter off. And this is a fancy kind of bread called a duvelskater that would have had dried fruits in it. So bread and cheese, bread and cheese, bread and cheese. And then there's meat here that's probably going to go into the pot there. And this little girl is warming her hands over a brazier in this box. There would be peat in here, smoldering peat, not any flames, but just giving off a nice warmth. Okay, so in a codicil to her will that was dated in August of 1693, when she must have known she was dying because she died 2 months later, she left all of her clothing to her 3 surviving Kierstead daughters and a silver spoon to each of her daughters-in-law. So this was a mark of affection to leave a silver spoon to somebody. It was saying that I value you. Here is something of value for you, for nobody else, just for you. And we don't know what the spoons looked like. There are different ways of decorating spoons in the 17th century, but they were probably this bowl shaped, and then whatever the handle might have been. And if you didn't want to use the spoon for eating, you could always melt it down and sell the silver. And I'm sure most of the ones from the 17th century, that's what's happened to them. Now, her clothing. Cloth was expensive. It was expensive to make. It was expensive to buy. And then the labor that went into converting the cloth into clothing was also expensive. So when you look at probate inventories from this time period, clothes are listed along with other things of value. If you did a probate inventory today, I don't think anybody would list their clothes unless it maybe Queen Elizabeth, but she wouldn't have a probate inventory anyway. So she leaves her clothes to her daughters. So what clothes did she leave? Now, this is a colorized woodcut from the 17th century. You've got a skirt, a jacket, an apron.
How you?
Is there a problem?
I'm
Are,
looking.
are we okay?
Yes. I don't know. Somebody's making noise, but
Okay. All right. Well, remember the winters in the Netherlands, they're cold, they're damp. You don't have central heating, so you have to keep yourself warm. And one of the reasons that New Netherland was settled was for the fur trade. That was the principal reason why New Netherland was settled, because people wanted furs to keep warm. Now, typical of what a woman would wear, she'd have a shift, a blouse, a bodice, sometimes a jacket, a skirt, an apron or an overskirt, sometimes a collar, always a cap. You see the cap here under the scarf. So this is typical of what a woman would wear. The shift, you didn't take off. You wore it to bed, then you just put your clothes on top of it. And if you took a bath, you would keep your shift on, maybe, and then just change it for a dry one. Okay, so here you can see the bodice and the shift and the skirt. And again, see down here the little foot warmer with a smoldering peat in it to keep your feet warm on the cold floor. And here this lady has her fur-lined jacket. Now, the mistress and the servant have the same articles of clothing, but they're made of different materials. Her jacket is velvet and fur. Her skirt might be satin, we don't know, but they're the same things. The shift, the blouse, the bodice, the skirt, the basic thing. And women's clothes always had to account for pregnancy. And that's why, what, next one? Bodices, because you could lace it, and they were laced rather than buttoned because then there's more room for adjustment. Now, the way that the bodices were laced is there were holes and you had to put the lace through the holes. And if you've ever tried to put the shoelace through your shoes when you lost the little aglet thing on the end of it, that's difficult. So the way that this was solved was with a bodkin. A bodkin is like a big needle. And if you look very closely here, you can see that the woman who is doing up her bodice here, she's just nursed the baby. Now she's doing up her bodice. She's holding a little bodkin that she's using to put the laces through her bodice. And here is a bodkin with the name Sara Roelofse, and it was found at a Mohawk site, upstate New York, by not an archaeologist, but somebody who I guess you could say is halfway in between an amateur archaeologist and a pot hunter. And it's made of silver, and we don't know where it is because after the gentleman died, we don't know what happened to it. But this is, luckily, we have a picture of it. And how it got into a site in upstate New York, a Mohawk site, upstate New York, we don't know. Did Sarah give it to somebody? Did somebody take it? Did she lose it and somebody found it? We just don't know. We could have all sorts of speculations, but we just don't know. But it's pretty extraordinary to find this sort of artifact. And I do hope it surfaces again someday. Okay, so this picture of her is a little bit fanciful. And it was drawn in the 30s. and probably a little bit fanciful about all the other figures too. But it's a tribute to her, and it's a tribute to the life that she lived and the things that she did. And we can try to interpret what her life was like, but it's inevitable that what we think is colored by the way we look at the world. We don't know how she looked at the world. And, and all we can do is try to see what we can find out about her. Now, she was an exceptional woman, and we can pay tribute to her. No matter what her motivations were, her reasons, we know that she was an exceptional person in an exceptional time. So that's my quick summary of the life of Sara Roloff. So now questions. If I could just talk about Sarah and enslaved Africans.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I didn't mention that in this talk because I talked about it the last time I spoke to you guys. She was unique because when she died, in her will, she mentions um, a number of people in her household who were enslaved, and she leaves each person to somebody specific in her family. And at least 3 of those enslaved people were children, and at least one was a Native American. So this to me is the big enigma of her life. Why did she have these enslaved people in her household? And especially because some of them were children. Was she trying to help them? Or I would like to think she was trying to help them, but she didn't leave them all to one of her descendants. She left one to one, one to one, one to one, one to one. But she was very careful, it seems, about who she left to whom. It wasn't just this person should go anywhere. It was this person should go to my daughter, Rachel. This person should go to my granddaughter. And so this is an issue now. Her stepfather, Dominic Bogardus, had served as a minister on the west coast of Africa, and he baptized a number of Africans in New Amsterdam, and both adults and children. And he was as anti-slavery as you could be as an employee of the West India Company at that time. So we don't really know. Plus, she was given the land that became the African burial ground later on. Actually, it was given to Cornelius van Borsum again for when she acted as a translator. So did she must have given permission to people to use that as a burial ground. There's so much that we don't know about her relationship with Africans, both enslaved and free in New Amsterdam and later New York. I just don't know. It's the one thing that I really, really would love to be able to. You can't talk to somebody from the 17th century, but if I could, I would.
Right.
So
yeah, there's several people in my life that are like that. I wish I could go back.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah.
Someone wrote, have you heard of a purse that was given by Oratam?
I remember some vague reference to it, but when I was putting this talk together, I couldn't find anything. And a purse is sort of a vague term. It would have, I don't know. So I really can't say anything about that.
I have a newspaper article about a wampum belt that was given to her or owned by her. I should share that with you for your talk.
I think you might have, and I forgot where it was.
Oh, okay.
But could you send it to me again? I'd appreciate it. And that would be That would be logical because wampum was used to express a relationship among Native Americans rather than as currency. So, you know, but yeah, thank you. I would appreciate seeing that again.
Yeah. Those kind of things are, well, we have things like that in our collection,
Uh-huh,
anyway, that you don't know if it's wishful thinking or, a story made up by somebody to entertain somebody. That was
uh-huh,
another thing that, the tile storytelling. We have a quilt called a storybook quilt,
uh-huh.
and was the same idea to point to a different figure on the quilt at bedtime for stories.
Yeah. Yeah, if
Um,
you don't have little golden books. Very cool.
all all right. Well, that was just fantastic, Maida.
Well,
Really
thank
appreciate you
thank you.
doing this for us.
Thank you.
Hmm.